Hello, I'm going to talk today about some of the work that we've been doing in my lab, focusing on deep neural networks and asking how well we think they function as explanatory models for cognitive processes. And I'll be doing this in the context of two domains, vision and language. To develop explanatory models of human dynamic cognitive processes such as visual object recognition or spoken language comprehension, we need to develop computationally explicit accounts of what neural computations support these processes and where and when they are located in the brain. Today I'm going to consider how far DNNs for vision and language can be related to these explanatory goals. This means that we need to go beyond only matching input-output relations and try to relate the internal properties of DNN processes in any given domain to the underlying brain systems supporting human performance. To do this, we need a well-developed biological model so that we can interpret the details of how the computational model works in any cognitive domain. We need this in order to bootstrap into other aspects of the cognitive domain of interest. Vision and language are very different in their relationship to DNNs. In the case of visual object recognition, we've got very well developed and detailed biological models of vision. Similarly, DNNs have proved to be useful for developing computational models of vision. But, as I will argue, DNN accounts of visual object processing are limited in that they don't actually include higher level processes associated with the meaning of objects. Their focus is entirely on the visual properties of objects. But what is a model of object recognition worth if it doesn't capture the meaning of an object? Language processing is very different. Language is more challenging because there's no detailed and comprehensive biological model, and current computational models are motivated by engineering solutions with little reference to the human system. This makes it less straightforward to relate DNN language models to operations in the human brain. In my talk today, I'll discuss current research relating these two black boxes to each other, showing how DNNs may be profitably related to human neural solutions. Starting with visual object processing, we already have a well-established biological model of vision consisting of a hierarchy of visual processing in the inferior temporal cortex. This provides an important reference point. Along this visual pathway, increasingly anterior regions process increasingly complex visual information. Neurons coding for simple feature conjunctions are located in posterior sites, with more complex conjunctions of features in anterior sites. The perirhinal cortex, at the top of the pathway, contains neurons that can do the most complex feature integration, which enables the disambiguation of highly similar objects. So turning to computational modeling, there's a strong tradition in machine vision that reflects these theories of cortical organization. But there's more than visual processing alone going on along the ventral processing stream. Similar to the visual system, there's a semantic hierarchy along the stream, going from the processing of simple semantic features in posterior sites and more complex feature integration in more anterior sites. This underpins the semantic processing of visual objects and is essential for constructing the meaning of an object that we are viewing. This well-attested model of visual object processing enables us to make direct comparisons between DNN systems for object recognition and the real-time neural activity of human perceivers. This kind of approach shows that DNNs are very successful in modeling the early stages of visual processing in the brain, but fail to capture meaning-related processes. Let's look at some of the evidence for a conceptual hierarchy along the ventral stream. This slide shows the results of an fMRI study in which subjects named familiar visual objects like apple, car, rabbit, as they were being scanned. To test for different kinds of semantic information along the ventral processing stream, we constructed a variety of different kinds of semantic feature models, with some models capturing different kinds of category structure, like animals or tools, while others captured more fine-grained properties of objects. We tested all of these models against the brain data along the ventral stream to see whether, as we expected, category information was associated with neural activity in the fusiform, and more object-specific, more fine-grained semantic information was associated with neural activity in the anterior temporal cortex. We tested each of our models against the fMRI data along the ventral stream using RSA, representational dissimilarity analysis developed by Nico Kriegerscourt. As you can see in the slide, the results showed a gradient of semantic specificity along the ventral processing stream, with category information represented along posterior fusiform and object-specific, more fine-grained semantic information in the anterior medial temporal cortex, especially in the perirhinal cortex. We've seen that both vision and meaning are processed along the ventral stream, but one of the important questions that we still don't understand is, how does vision activate meaning? To address this question, we turn to computational modelling and ask, can DNNs explain how vision activates meaning? This slide shows a standard DNN processing visual inputs. The DNN consists of various layers processing different aspects of the visual input. For example, lower layers of the DNN better match early stages of visual processing, whereas higher layers of the DNN better match later stages of the stream. However, it's important to keep in mind that DNN models are designed to distinguish between objects and associate each object with its correct label. But there's no semantic content in the relationship between object and label. Unlike humans, DNNs don't activate conceptual information. To model the interaction between vision and meaning, we combined two computationally explicit models, a visual model and a semantic neural network. The penultimate layer of the DNN serves as input to the semantic model, and the semantic model consists of a recurrent attractor network where concepts are represented as patterns of activation across a network of semantic features. The semantic model was able to represent both shared category information and distinctive object-specific information. Through training, the model associated high-level visual information found in later stages of the DNN with concept features over the time course of object processing. And in the trained semantic network, semantic features activated gradually over the course of 20 time ticks. The activation of each feature was facilitated by feed-forward connectivity from later stages of the visual DNN, as well as lateral recurrent activity from other features in the semantic layer. The model therefore exploits statistical dependencies between high-level visual information and semantic features. Now, to test this model, we obtained fMRI data while people named common objects. We tested the output of the combined visual and semantic model at each layer in the model against neural data in key regions of interest. This slide shows the results of the fMRI object naming study. It shows brain regions known from previous studies to be involved in vision and semantics, and in each region we can see the correlations between fMRI activity and the different layers in the DNN and semantic models. For example, early visual regions, for example A on the slide, show the strongest model fit between fMRI activity and early visual stages of the DNN, and no significant fit of semantic models. In contrast, the perirhinal cortex, DE on the slide, shows significant correlations between fMRI activity and later layers in the semantic model. These results show that this approach is picking up differential visual and semantic effects associated with different layers in the DNN. It shows early effects of the visual model in posterior fusiform and later effects of the semantic model in anterior temporal regions. So this research demonstrates that DNN models of vision alone don't accurately capture the relationship between vision and meaning. That is, they do not provide a model of visual object processing. To achieve this, the visual DNN needed to be connected to a model of semantics. And we found that in this model, Vision activates meaning through the penultimate layer of the visual DNNs, serving as an input to the semantic attractor model. In the attractor network, concepts are represented as patterns of activation across a network of semantic features. This kind of model enables us to represent both features that are shared with many other concepts, providing category information, and other features that are distinctive, providing object-specific information. And through training, the combined model associates high-level visual information found in later stages of the DNN with concept features over the time course of object processing. And it does this by exploiting the statistical dependencies between high-level visual information and semantic features. Vision is one of the best cases for DNNs, largely because there's a very well-developed neurobiological model. But to understand the relationship between the DNN and the biological model, it's important to know in as much detail as possible what the various computational stages of a DNN actually involve. And we can only do this by having a well-attested model of the human system. In our case, we had a specific question: how does vision support object meaning? And by relating a combined visual DNN and semantic attractor network, together with appropriate neurobiological models, we were able to at least generate some interesting hypotheses about how that might work. Now, in contrast, language is not like this. We are still dealing with two models that we don't understand, both the DNN and the human. We're now turning to some research that we've been doing using DNNs to help us understand the neurocomputations involved in spoken language comprehension. So first of all, for all of you who effortlessly understand language without thinking about it, a little bit of context to give you an idea of the complexities involved. This slide illustrates some of the properties of spoken language comprehension. So for example, that comprehending language involves accessing the meanings and the syntactic and semantic implications of each word as it's heard. It involves integration of each word into the developing context, processes of combination, and the rapid incremental activation and integration of multiple layers of different kinds of information, and the development of constraints of many different types that are placed on the upcoming speech. So we have multiple types of constraints, all converging on the interpretation of each incoming word. And in addition, the real-time computations involved in all these processes are very rapid, on the order of milliseconds. This requires that we use a neuroimaging method that provides measures of neural activation at millisecond temporal resolution. And MEG, magnetoencephalography, is the ideal method here, since it tells us both where and when, with millisecond accuracy, activity occurs in the brain. So why use a DNN, in this particular instance LSTM, to understand the neurobiology of incremental language interpretation? Well, two important aspects of human language are that it is both incremental and predictive. The system is constantly predicting upcoming words based on the prior context. LSTM, as a successful current natural language processing system, is also incremental and predictive. So it may be useful in understanding the computations involved in language comprehension because the LSTM output distribution can be used as a model of how the prior context constrains upcoming words in spoken language. And we can use this distributed model to test against neural language processing data. An important point here is that we really need to understand the computational history of prediction and the types of information carried in the prediction. A computational account that simply matches the output properties of the human system isn't sufficient. We need to understand the inner workings of the model and relate them to what we know about human cognition. Before I go on, I want to stress that what I'm going to talk about in the remaining time is work in progress and is illustrative of our approach rather than being a final story. In our experiments, we've used LSTM, standing for long short-term memory, which involves an input, in this case words, going through different layers, finally producing an output which is called the Softmax layer. This model was trained on a 1 billion word corpus and has an input layer, 2 hidden layers, and a softmax output layer. This model is a powerful but poorly understood black box. As each new word is encountered, the model develops a set of probabilistic predictions of what the next word will be. The next few slides will give you an idea of these probabilistic predictions. The sentence so far is presented at the top of the slide. The manager explained that. And below you can see the continuations that the DNN produces in response to that input, together with their probability. You can see that both he and the are the words that are the most highly probable continuations, although there are many more that are possible with much lower probabilities. Here's another example of a probabilistic output distribution. You can see that the model is making sensible predictions at every word. And as you can see here, these predictions are not only accurate and make sense, but they're similar to those produced by humans. LSTM captures the sequential predictive structure of sentences. How does it do this? To discover what information it's using internally across the layers to generate predictions, we feed sentences to the LSTM, word by word, and correlate activity with different types of syntactic and semantic linguistic knowledge. We also relate LSTM activity with neural activity obtained while human subjects are listening to the sentences in a MEG study. The goal here is to bootstrap sufficient understanding of how the LSTM works to enable the LSTM to become an explanatory model which we can use in trying to understand the neurocomputational processes of predictions in human listeners. This research was conceived of and carried out by one of my graduate students, Hun Choi, a hugely intelligent young man. Our main goal here was to see whether LSTM prediction models can help us to understand the neurobiology of incremental interpretation in human listeners. So we generated models of LSTM activity at each layer of the model. We collected neural data in a MEG study of people listening to a variety of spoken sentences, and we tested the relationship between the models of LSTM activity and MEG data. This slide shows the types of sentences we used in the experiment. The first noun, the experience walker, is likely to be interpreted as the subject noun of the sentence and combines with the upcoming verb chose. At this point, the sentence is ambiguous because the verb chose is associated with different probabilistic structures. For example, a direct object construction marked by the, or a prepositional phrase to, with a stronger preference for a direct object. And within each of these structural preferences, the semantics of the preceding words constrains the listener's preference for path rather than card. So what are the neural computations that are involved in these processes of ambiguity, prediction, and resolution? We turn to LSTM to develop models of incremental interpretation which we could test against the MEG data. To understand the types of computations carried out in each layer, we first correlated activity in each of the layers with a variety of language models, syntax, for example, and semantics, to see what kinds of representation and predictions the DNN was constructing. We also correlated activity in each layer of the DNN with MEG neural activity. This slide shows the correlations between DNN activity in each layer and language models, a process which helps us to understand the kinds of computations that are being constructed by the DNN. The language models included various models of semantics, for example, the semantics of the subject-noun, semantics of the verb, and models which test for evidence of syntactic and semantic prediction. As you can see from the slide, at the beginning of the sentence, when the subject-noun phrase, the experience walker, is initially encountered, the LSTM 0 initially represents the semantics of the subject-noun in the pale blue line, and when the verb is encountered, it represents the semantics of the verb, the dark blue line. There are no predictions. LSTM 1, the second hidden layer, shows weaker subject-noun semantics and strong verb semantics as the verb is encountered, which persists during the following word. and it also shows evidence of prediction of the semantics of the complement noun at the article the. LSTM Softmax. At this point, the LSTM has developed predictions about the kinds of syntactic structures that are possible, or preferably, associated with the verb, and it has also generated prediction of the semantics of the complement at the onset of the complement phrase the, and the semantics of the verb. So these results show similarities between the kinds of representations and predictions generated by the LSTM and those produced by humans as they interpret spoken language. The previous analysis helped us to interpret the kinds of computations generated by the DNN layers. We next look at the neural activity measured by Meg in each of the LSTM layers at each word throughout the sentence. We're looking for neural timing and location effects in the brain, and this timing is particularly important since we're interested in incrementality. Here we see how activity in each of the 3 DNN layers is correlated with Meg neural activity. We focus here on the subject noun, the experienced walker, and its role in predicting the upcoming verb. Processing of the subject noun is accompanied by activity in all layers. In LSTM 0, we see neural correlations in bilateral MTG and the angular gyrus brain regions, and also left frontal regions. LSTM 1 shows only right hemisphere effects, again middle temporal gyrus and angular gyrus. And the softmax layer only shows activity in the right middle temporal gyrus. Now, since the MTG is frequently associated with semantic processing, we might speculate that different aspects of semantics are at this point being computed by the different layers. As we saw in the previous slide, softmax layer at the subject noun is involved in processing the semantics of the subject noun and predicting the upcoming verb. These processes correlate with neural activity in the right hemisphere middle temporal gyrus, brain regions known to be involved in semantic processing. In the lower panel of the slide, we see that comparable data from human subjects is associated with neural activity in the same right hemisphere middle temporal gyrus neural regions as the softmax layer. So far, we've been focusing on the correlations between activity in the LSTM and brain activity at the subject noun. Here we focus on the verb and the multiple probabilistic constraints associated with the verb in the sentence. When the subject noun and verb are presented to the DNN, we see in layer 0, LSTM 0, the first hidden layer, there are weak and transient effects in posterior middle temporal cortex and angular gyrus. In layer 1, we see similar effects as shown in layer 0. So these 2 layers are only weakly interested in probabilistic predictions generated by the verb. In contrast, the softmax layer is strongly interested in the probabilistic predictions as shown by robust effects in bilateral frontal regions, left angular gyrus, and left middle temporal gyrus. These regions are plausibly involved in competition and/or selection processes. These analyses, while only preliminary, illustrate that we can go beyond simply focusing on the output of the softmax layer when looking at the relationship between DNNs and language. We can test word by word throughout a sentence to try to understand the incremental processes in the real-time processing of spoken language. We have seen how activity throughout the DNN layers can be interpreted using different models of linguistic knowledge and relating activity in the DNN to time-sensitive neural activity and our current understanding of language and the brain. Making this level of detailed comparison between the computational operations within the DNN and the computational operations that we can now examine in real time in the human brain may help to build an evidence-based and hopefully explanatory understanding of dynamic cognitive functions.